I love going for hikes, especially in the fall, and especially with company, but beggars can't be choosers, and I'm happy to go alone. There's a river that runs around and through my university campus, and the campus itself is surrounded by heavily forested areas. It really looks quite idyllic in the fall, with the changing colors, watching the leaves come down the river. I have this favorite little spot in the woods where the bank becomes sand shortly before touching the water. I like to take my shoes off and pretend I'm at the beach, but with more shade and better smells. Last Saturday I was at that spot, taking it all in, when I saw something peculiar in the water, floating downstream towards me. It was a person. They were face down, floating with their back hunched up in the air. I had remembered learning that this is what someone looks like when they've drowned, and I began to panic. My shoes were already off, and I jumped in to rescue them. The water was moving pretty fast, but I tapped him on the back pretty hard to let him know I was there and ask if he was okay, but his body merely bobbed with the pressure I applied. It was shallow enough to stand, and I grabbed him by the right arm and around the torso, and began making the difficult journey back through the rapid water. I stumbled a few times, and his head bumped into mine, but I managed to get back and lay him as gently as I could down on the small beach. It wasn't until then that I noticed his face. It was one of the creepiest expressions I'd ever seen. His eyes were so wide they looked like they were about to pop out of his skull, and he had a grin unnaturally large. It looked more like the face I'd expect to see on the man who drowned him than on him. I was too terrified to even attempt CPR, but I called 911 immediately. The police and ambulance showed up, and I was questioned briefly. Apparently he had been dead for hours before I found him. He was a sophomore at the same school as me, and foul play was suspected. It's been about a week since then, but it has not yet been resolved how he died, or why he had that look on his face. I'm a graduate student, and these days with the quarantine, all the courses I TA are online. One of them, a structure and bonding physical chemistry course, a little drier than the rest, I have to do a lot of marking for, and I live stream a tutorial once a week to help students understand the difficult subject matter. I often wonder if it's a waste of time, as they often look just as asleep as they do in lecture. But it's pretty easy for me and it's good money, so I make do. There are only about 8 people in my tutorial group, so there would be lots of time for individual questions if they asked any. This one guy in my class, Dustin, I assume he lives with his parents, because he always live streams from the middle of this big, empty, dark room inside of a large house. Behind him on the left is always this staircase that leads, obviously, to the second floor, and something about it always just catches my eye. It's just always very dimly lit, and it always makes me wonder if he's in that huge house by himself, or if his parents are upstairs. What's going on up those stairs? After all, I'm a bit of a horror guy, and I like to run wild with my imagination. What was particularly interesting about today's class is that there seemed to be a golden retriever sitting on the staircase and watching the lecture unfold. I thought that was kind of cute, and I appreciated the opportunity to teach structural chemistry to a golden retriever. By the end of tutorial, there were about 2 of the 8 students full-on sleeping. Told them to have a good weekend, took one last glance at that golden retriever, who was now standing up. It wasn't actually a golden retriever at all. It was a human. They were wearing a mask, and they'd pulled out a knife. "Dustin?" I started to say, just as he hung up. I continued sitting in the virtual meeting room, far after everyone else had left, wondering what I had just seen and second-guessing myself. I let it go, thinking it was just one of those live stream pranks you see. But on Monday, Dustin wasn't present in class. Over the next few weeks, he never handed in another assignment. I asked the professor if he'd dropped out. She got in touch with the administration, and no, at least if he had intended to drop out, he hadn't informed them of it. I really don't know anything about the guy, but I told my professor what I thought I saw. She shrugged her shoulders. I don't know what happened to Dustin, but I just hope for his sake that was a prank. Just over a year ago, I lived downtown on the 4th floor of an apartment building. I had a boyfriend at the time, who's still dating me now, but at the time we weren't living together. He would just come over every other night. One morning, I awoke to find that I was holding on to something. It was a Polaroid photograph. It was of me, sleeping, and it was titled My Suite. I looked over beside me to see my boyfriend sound asleep. Gradually, he rolled over and opened his lazy eyes. We smiled at each other, and I held up the photo. "This is very cute," I said, "but not cute of me. Please stop taking pictures of me while I'm asleep." He had a strange look on his face, like he didn't know what I was talking about, and he sort of chuckled. I was still waving the image in front of his face, and he grabbed onto it and took a closer look. "I didn't take this," he said, then smirked at me like he thought I took it and I was messing with him. I didn't believe him, obviously. I locked the door to the apartment every night. I don't know why he would lie about this. It was very irritating at the time, but I let it go, seeing as no real harm was done, and I threw out the picture. The next night, he wasn't staying over, but in the morning I awoke to yet another Polaroid picture on my bedside table. This one also of me sleeping. My blood slowly went cold as I realized the implications. I bolted out of bed and ran to the front door. It was locked. Both my sets of keys were hanging where I had left them by the door. My boyfriend didn't have a copy of my key. The next place my mind went to, is there someone inside the apartment with me right now? I panicked, flung a few clothes on, and left. I called my boyfriend, and he came over and searched with me. I could tell my panic was beginning to spread to him as well. Every closet seemed to be clear, and there was no sign that anyone had broken in. Even if they had broken a window, how would they have gotten in? We were on the 4th floor. We reasoned that someone must have taken a copy of my key sometime when I had placed it down somewhere in public. I stayed overnight with my boyfriend for 2 days while waiting for the locksmith. No photos appeared the mornings that I was at my boyfriend's house, and when I went back to my own bed, I was still afraid and made my boyfriend come with me. The next morning, there were no new photos. Not in my hand, not on the bedside table, not anywhere in the apartment. I breathed a sigh of relief. I was also finally questioned in regards to the report I made with the police a few days earlier. They got a hold of my building's security tapes and identified a man coming into my apartment using a key in the middle of the night. They said they'd keep an eye out and were in contact with my building manager. Half a week went by, and I checked the mail. There was a Polaroid photo of me through the window. I can't begin to imagine the lengths that man went to get to the 4th floor and take a photo of me through the window. I was absolutely distraught once again. Reached out to my boyfriend, who suggested I move. I stayed with him for a few weeks while we looked for a place together, and since moving, a year later, there haven't been any new incidents. I guess as a silver lining to this, I'm finally living with my amazing boyfriend, but I'll always wonder who that man was and why he took such an interest in me. I went on one date with this guy from Tinder. He asked a lot of questions about my cat, Princess. Said he was big into animals. I'm always happy to talk about my princess, and I probably did for about 10 minutes straight. He just seemed to be loving it, and I took that as a big green flag. He started comparing some of the behaviors of my cat to those exhibited by his dog, and he wanted to show me pictures. I happily obliged. It was a cute little terrier he showed me on his phone. I took it from him to get a better look, and he seemed uncomfortable when I grabbed the phone from his hand. In an attempt to zoom in on his dog's face, I accidentally swiped the camera roll over to see a picture of what looked like a woman's body that had been bleeding out strapped down to a chair. Her hair was messy and you couldn't see her face. There were large dark bruises all over her and lacerations on her wrists from where the zip ties had been pulling. I quickly swiped back to his dog and looked up. He was looking at my eyes and not at his phone. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I just prayed that he couldn't see the hairs standing up on my arms and the goosebumps all over my neck. I tried to play it cool for the rest of the date, but inside I was panicking. At the end, I told him it was nice to meet him, got up, got my coat on. He stood up too, asking if he could walk me home. I told him I lived pretty far away and that I was Ubering. I don't, but I called an Uber anyway. He waited with me by the door of the coffee shop. It was dark outside, and the light from inside the shop was reflecting off the door as we stood side by side silently. I could see in the reflection that he was just glaring at me, expressionless. He must have known, but there was nothing he could do about it. He gave me a fake smile as I got into the Uber, and when I got home, I asked the driver to wait a moment to make sure I got inside all right. I was very quick to lock the door behind me when I got in, and I was freaking out for most of the rest of the week. I'm so glad I never gave him my address.